Dr. Christina Smith, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate your time. Could you just tell us a little bit about your background in occupational therapy?
Sure, I am very excited to be here with you. I appreciate the invitation, and I have been practicing since 2007, so almost 20 years. It has flown by. It's been an incredible journey. I've learned so much from being an entry-level clinician to now associate professor at the Medical University of South Carolina, where I've been able to develop and teach the leadership and management courses in our new occupational therapy doctorate program. I've also been very fortunate to have different leadership roles throughout our university, as well as at our state association, and then through the AOTA over the past couple years. The relationships have been incredible with colleagues such as yourself, as well as patients, students, and I am very excited to be here. I did own a private practice for about 8.5 years, which closed in 2020, sadly. We were committed to providing access to quality care, particularly for underserved communities with language barriers, with rural families and lower income families as well. But we saw everyone uh, across the spectrum of society through that journey.
Well, I just think, especially right now in the last few years, it probably has always been, but I think our awareness of issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion are so important for everyone. But, we're going to talk today a lot about how that kind of influences our profession and the professionals that we work with. And I know, as you said, as a practitioner and as a leader, and in your work at MUSC, you've been very involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So could you just talk a little bit about how you became interested in the topic, or why it's been such a passion for you within the profession?
Absolutely. So I have grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, since the age of 3 years old. And so during my time here, most of my interactions were cross-cultural in some way. Um, I really grew up between different cultures, and even racial and ethnically as well. My mother is lighter skinned, my father is darker skinned, and so when their social groups were very different, as a result of that. I'm very fortunate in that I'm able to connect with people from different backgrounds, professionally and personally, as an adult in unique ways. It was a different skill set that I think was developed, and mindset, being able to kind of uh, move through, and really the Puerto Rican um, cultural background is a mixed race with uh, Dutch and Spaniards and Africans coming through the island. You have the indigenous population there as well. So it really is kind of its own um, melting pot, for lack of a better word. And so for me personally, there was um, that background root.
Mhm.
Uh, Growing up, my mother had a bit of a language barrier, and so I would have to review the notes that she would send to school to my teachers because of grammar and spelling. And so there have just been different circumstances throughout my lifetime along those lines. And as an occupational therapy student, um, I remember looking for some kind of organization around Hispanic Latino student needs, or faculty or staff, and there were no resources that were accessible at my university. And so I helped start one, the MEST Alliance for Hispanic Health, and that group continues to be strong today, almost 20 years later.
Mhm.
I'm very proud of that. And so that's a little bit about some of my early interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion. as I entered into the profession, I continued to see a need for transformational changes for our profession, for our workforce, for the resources that were available for the educational processes, for the structures within our professional associations and leadership roles, as well as what we recognize, who we recognize, what are the various aspects of our society that have been maybe marginalized
Mhm.
historically that we can recognize, value, and help to bring to the forefront to help us to move forward together.
Yeah, well, I'm happy that you're in the profession and happy that you've been doing this important work. Could you talk, and obviously with culture is such an important part of all that we do as occupational therapists, not that it isn't for other people in healthcare and educational settings, but, so much of occupation is rooted obviously in culture. Could you just kind of start by defining some terms? So diversity, equity, inclusion, kind of what that means to you. And we'll have some resources at occupationaltherapy.com that'll help kind of extrapolate this as well. So,
Absolutely. So, diversity at its core is really just differences, differences within um, preferences, choices, contexts, appearances. I tell the students when we're having an interview day, people may talk differently, walk differently, or act a little differently, but we want to ensure that everyone feels that they belong, that they have a
mhm,
place here. And that's where the inclusion piece comes in. When individuals or groups or populations are left on the outside or in the margins. That is that exclusion piece, which is the opposite of inclusion, which is what we're seeking to move forward in our profession and in healthcare at large.
sure.
Occupational therapy is one of the many health professions that have been really sounding the alarm in this area that we need to do better to serve our populations, but also to serve our workforce, our students, and our future workforce and consumers of our services as well. And it is dire in that our society is growing more diverse
Mhm,
racially and ethnically. We also look at other aspects of diversity as well. Religious minorities, for example, sexual and gender minorities, uh, the disability, individuals with disabilities, just to name a few.
mhm,
And so inclusion is about incorporating everyone and creating a space for that. Non-discrimination is another term that is used to help describe when we're not excluding people, we're not discriminating against them in some way. And equity is where everyone has access to the same opportunities and outcomes at the end of the day. And these are terms that are utilized by the World Health Organization and other national healthcare and international healthcare organizations. And so I want to address a little bit that sometimes people have concerns about reverse discrimination or about that anti-racism means anti-dominant groups in some way. And really at its core, inclusion and these concepts do not promote excluding anyone or discriminating against anyone. And so it is important that we consider that as we provide initiatives, strategies, and resources as well.
yeah. Could you talk a little bit about sort of the difference between inclusion and tolerance, and what that might mean, within the profession, or when we're working with, some of the clients that we're working with, or with our coworkers?
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk a little bit about educational theory for a
Sure,
second.
sure.
So Bloom's taxonomy is discussed frequently. We talk about knowledge, we talk about skills, and then we talk about attitudes and values. And this really falls under the attitudes and values for our students and our practitioners in terms of our attitudes towards others. Tolerance is maybe acceptance, but there is that concept of there's a little bit of hostility, a little abrasiveness
Mhm,
potentially with it. Versus inclusion, there is a value, there are positive connotations to it. Um, there's a respect as well that really underlies this concept of inclusion that is not always present when we talk about tolerance. And I remember as a student, there was a Martin Luther King Jr. event where I was invited to provide some remarks, and this was 2005, and I remember the one of the key speakers talking about tolerance, and when I spoke, I added in that we will also bring appreciation, wonder, value to individuals that are not like ourselves. And we could get into all kinds of philosophical discussions, but we won't do that here.
mhm. But I think there is just something about it, like curiosity around, valuing cultures that are not your own, and how are we able to learn from each other is just so important in this journey that we're certainly all on. And so I'll have a couple more words for you
Sure.
um, to talk about it. Jedi is something that we hear out there every now and again.
Right. So JEDI is a term which stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And interestingly enough, some people from underrepresented groups reject the acronym JEDI
Mhm,
for whatever reasons it may be. Um, but I'll also add that multiple other terms have been included in the lexicon of diversity, and so A for accessibility has been included, B for belonging as well. And so you'll see things like day job or deja. And so there are a lot of different variations. It's interesting because the pandemic seemed to catalyze this era of hyper change for us with regard to technology, but also with racial and ethnic circumstances in our society. And so we saw this huge explosion of literature being published, resources being generated, um, uh, theoretical frameworks um, and context um, being disseminated. And so I know we'll talk about some of the current socio-political aspects here shortly, but
mhm,
um, it is an area that is rapidly changing, and so
mhm.
it's important to continue to uh, educate ourselves and learn all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we talk about some of those things? I know, as you said during COVID, it was very stressful for everyone, but I think especially for people, from the African American community in the United States, around George Floyd and just that the summer of, kind of all of our discontent, it seemed like. But you were on the AOTA board of directors at that time, and you're certainly not speaking for them now. But could you just talk a little bit about what that was like and what were you hearing from members?
Sure. So I was elected in January 2020 to the board of directors for the AOTA. Did not know that it was going to be as exciting a time as it was going to be.
Yeah.
And June, that was my first board meeting. It was a preview meeting for me, essentially. And just the pain, um, that people in my immediate, my local, and then at the national levels were experiencing was just unbelievable. Um, uh, so the other key part of the pandemic at that time was that it really brought to light these health disparities that people had been trying to call attention to for really several decades at
Mhm.
that point. Back in 2002, the Institute of Medicine published their groundbreaking report on racial and ethnic disparities in the healthcare system. And so to see it in hyper time playing out with lives that were lost disproportionately within racial and ethnic minority groups was unprecedented. And so the lived experiences of those who lost so many. I had a student that lost four people in
Wow.
1 year um, during 2020, and understanding that generationally, often you had multiple generations living under one roof in some cultures and in some homes within the United States. There was so much pain and suffering, and then you add on top of that the economic repercussions that disproportionately affected people in the hospitality and tourism industries, um, and in other industries as well that people were experiencing at that time. And so it just became this trifecta in a sense for people with the killing of George Floyd. And so, um, which again was not an isolated incident. There were concerns about police brutality for years. I remember as a child hearing about Rodney King in Los Angeles. And again, it wasn't just one incident, it really bubbled to the surface uh, some of the challenges that had been ongoing for decades. So, as a board member, um, I was the first person of color, racial and ethnic minority to be on the board of directors in several decades at that point.
Wow.
Um, and so everything was on Zoom also unexpectedly. Typically, we have face to face meetings in Bethesda, Maryland at the headquarters, but um, it was a very difficult time. Um, the board members who I have been able to get to know very well since that time, I know were committed to helping us to move forward in these areas, but there were not a lot of strategies that were evident. And it's been this process of evolution. We had a national conference called Occupational Therapy Evolving Diversity, Equity, and Justice back in, I believe it was 2021. And so we really are. It's this era of hyper change. People are
Mhm.
trying to do their best. They're trying to navigate. They're hosting listening sessions. They're creating resources. They're advocating. And at times we mess up. We don't always get it right as individuals, as groups, as organizations. Um, but it's important that we learn from that. We do better in the future. We continue to listen, especially before we speak, and that, for me, has been something I've been focusing on more
Mhm.
these last couple years. And ultimately, it's through the dialogue. Calming down is important for that. There's this great book called Crucial Conversations,
Mhm.
which I have utilized throughout this journey
Mhm.
with diversity and culture. And so it talks about very important topics, which are very emotionally charged
Mhm.
potentially, and that we can calm down as a strategy for dialogue and discussion and progress to get to where we want to be.
Mhm.
because if we're not talking, we're not going to get anywhere. And if we're yelling, then there's defensiveness, there's that the threatening aspect, and that's not constructive either. So those have been some of the um, lessons that I've learned along the way.
Yeah, and I really appreciated a lot of the listening sessions, and I appreciated that that was sort of what the board started, at least in my outsider view, looking in. They started by listening, and so as a white male, I always uh, that's where I, especially now, am trying to really start with, because my first reaction often is to solve problems, and we I'm not the one to identify the problem. I need to listen to help figure out, and that's kind of what we're supposed to be doing as occupational therapists to begin with, right? Is to, it's not our goals, it's the goals of the individuals that we're trying to support. But I really appreciated the listening sessions, and it helped for me in some of my learning. And so to really listen to fellow occupational therapy practitioners that I'm older. I'm not that old yet, but I'm starting to feel like I'm starting to get on that older side of things. And I remember when I was in school, we really talked about cultural competency, and talked about really how it was important to be competent in cultures, and that we would, but really it was about supporting clients that we were working with, and really without any thought that maybe the fellow students, our fellow practitioners, came from underrepresented groups as well. And so that was really um, just important for me, I think, to hear about students and practitioners and academics that had negative experiences from other occupational therapy practitioners. So I don't know what the listening experiences were like for you and for the board, and has that really helped to influence some of the decisions that you made following, you know, that summer of 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. So the listening sessions were very important for one, for providing space for people to share
Hmm.
about uh, so in some situations things that had happened a long time before, and in some there are daily occurrences that people are interacting with in some way. And so for the board of directors, the listening sessions were really one part of essentially a needs assessment
Hmm.
for our profession. We had an ad hoc DEI committee during that time that had already been started in February 2020, before the pandemic, before George Floyd. Uh, everyone, that initiative was started under President Wendy Hildenbrand and was moving forward. And so that group was tasked with assessing the needs at that time. And so there were surveys that went out, there were interviews with different stakeholders. The listening sessions became a part of that to help develop a strategic framework around diversity, equity, and inclusion at that time. And so now that group had recommended a permanent DEI committee for the AOTA. That was a part of the bylaws. It was going to be a part of having that person be the chair, be a member of the board of directors.
Hmm.
And so the board has moved forward with that. We have the DEI committee. They've been working incredibly hard these last couple years. We also have the chair of the DEI committee who has been serving with the board of directors with voice and not vote currently, and hopefully that will be changing at some point.
Hmm.
So the initiatives were there and starting. The listening sessions, especially having board members there, were helpful for
Hmm.
increasing understanding, assessing the needs, and being able to conceptualize some initiatives that would have real, concrete solutions and strategies for our profession. And the needs are multifaceted. We have educational needs, we have clinical practitioner needs, we have language access needs, we have advocacy and socio-political needs. And so from that strategic framework, we've had incredible momentum
Mhm.
in multiple areas through the AOTA since that time. I think communication of all those initiatives sometimes is a challenge because the emails will go out or it may be posted somewhere on a website. And sometimes there's so much information that
Mhm.
um, members may not be getting all of the information. And especially for non-members, it may be even more challenging. But there have been YouTube videos, podcasts, journals through AJOT, OT practice articles, um, uh, societal statements that we have that have been updated. We have ethics advisory opinions as well that are available and are being revised right now for the next iteration of the Code of Ethics. And the challenge that you mentioned, as far as for a long time, the focus was on the patient provider interaction, and
Mhm.
we weren't really talking about the workforce. That's an area that we were able to bring to the Ethics Commission through the Representative Assembly, actually, through a motion to expand the cultural, what then was cultural competence and sensitivity, to expand it to the workforce
Mhm.
inclusion as well. So, and now we have three different ethics advisories that are going to be related to culture and diversity in some way.
Mhm. Which is so important. And I think, just hopefully makes all of us better, makes the profession better, as we're, it's kind of that here comes everybody sort of mentality that we should all be in this together. And how do we best support others that are within the profession? And then there were some specific DEI initiatives that you mentioned that the board helped to fund. Do you want to talk about the toolkit and how that came into being, and maybe what some of the items on the toolkit are? And I believe the toolkit is free and is open to members and non-members alike, right?
Sure. So the modules are great resources that are available for students, practitioners, educators, and it's growing. There's information being added from time to time. There are resources around case studies. There are videos available. There are links to official documents related to diversity, equity, inclusion. There is a glossary of terms available, and many articles that have been linked through the DEI toolkit as well. There may be some that are available behind the firewall to members only, but for the most part, the resources are available to the general public.
And was that something the board was really intentional about, to have a lot of resources available, not just we want members, obviously it's a member driven organization. I know I had a friend that was the president of the Ohio OT Association at one point, went and testified before the Ohio House or Senate and said that, she represented the 10,000 occupational therapy practitioners in the state of Ohio. And the member of the House or Senate said, well, how many members are in your committee and or in your organization? It was like, 2,500 or whatever it was. And so they said, no, you're representing 2,500, not 10,000. So, but anyway, was that important to have those resources available to everybody?
Yes, absolutely. The For the profession to have the kind of transformational change that we can go back to the centennial vision of having a profession that is powerful, widely recognized, evidence-based, with a diverse and globally connected workforce meeting society's occupational needs. Society's occupational needs really will need to be addressed by our entire profession,
Mhm.
including our students, our clinicians, our faculty, our researchers, our inventors, our entrepreneurs. All of all of us are a part of meeting society's occupational needs. And with Vision 2025, that really helped to focus even more so on providing and enabling occupation for all. And so it is important that these kinds of resources be accessible and available um, to our profession at large. And often we don't think about those that are entering into the profession. I'm an admissions director currently, and so this is
Mhm.
something I think about frequently. Uh, those prospective students don't have access to membership resources, but they do have access to our website, and so this is a part of um, the the perception that we're building for them, even entering into the profession at large.
Yeah, and you mentioned Vision 2025, so I'm going to read it verbatim. I know you probably haven't memorized, but just in case, and you actually probably do, but um, I don't. But I know where it is, so I can always go to it when I need to. But Vision 2025, as an inclusive profession, occupational therapy maximizes health, well-being, and quality of life for all people, populations, and communities through effective solutions that facilitate participation in everyday living. And I think the inclusive piece is really important, and we're an inclusive profession. And as I said, I think that's uh, different, or there's more of an emphasis on the profession, not just on the people that we're working with us. But how do you see us doing currently with being inclusive as a profession, and how can we maybe get better at that? That's a loaded question, isn't it?
No, that's a great question. And so, for those of us who have been in the profession for a little while, we may remember that the as an inclusive profession was added later
Right.
after the first iteration of the
Yep.
vision statement back in around 2017. And so that piece of it is so critical. And it's something that as a society, we've been learning more and more over the years that in order to meet the needs of our diverse society, we must have a diverse profession and workforce that is helping to meet those needs in terms of having representation of individuals, of having the ideas, the strategies. We've learned from the research that diverse teams can outperform teams that do not have that diversity because of the um, uh, homogeneity of ideas, of values, of beliefs that may not think outside of the traditional box in the same ways. And so diversity, equity, inclusion, it's evidence-based. We have research that shows us that health outcomes are better, that access is better, um, that trust and rapport, safety, all of these different factors um, are better when there is diversity present within the workforce. And so when it comes to things like holistic admissions and mandatory trainings. Unfortunately, the mandatory can be this double-edged sword because people reject it. But often the people that reject the mandatory trainings are the ones that need it the most.
Mhm.
And so it's this process, and not any one of us is a quote unquote expert in all things DEI. We are all on a journey of learning, of growing, this thing we refer to as cultural humility is really critical.
Mhm.
And I think I tend to try to think in opposites whenever I'm trying to understand a construct. And so the opposite of humility is supremacy. And so, this concept of cultural humility is understanding, it's seeking to understand and appreciate in a positive way where others are coming from. What are
Mhm.
their needs? What are their desires? What are the barriers and challenges? What are the supports and strategies that they have in place? And when we speak about one person, we're speaking about one person, and they may
Mhm.
have many different identities that contribute to how they see themselves or the culture which they belong to. And so it's important to ask how people want to be identified. We talk about preferred pronouns for sexual and gender minorities. It's important to ask how they want to be identified with with their pronouns. When we talk about disability status, it's important to ask, do they prefer person first terminology or condition first terminology? And sometimes it's generational. We talk
Mhm.
about Latino communities. There's so much diversity just within Hispanic Latino communities. And now you have Latinx, which some of the older generations do not endorse.
Right.
You have some that are saying Latine with an E at the end because there's no gender associated with it, as in Latino or Latina. So again, these terms are evolving. They can vary from region to region. They can vary generationally, and so listening, learning, and especially I think w- with cultural competence, there has been this pushback that you can't be competent about all things culture. So
Mhm.
we've been in this exploration of terminology. Culturally relevant care is now a term that's being used. Culturally appropriate care. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services published the national class standards back in the early 2000s and then revised them in 2013, where class stands for culturally and linguistically appropriate services.
Mhm.
Excuse me, standards, culturally and linguistically appropriate standards. And so there is a lot of terminology. Some have written about transcultural competence. I believe that was a group with Dr. Michael Lawama. And so uh, learning, becoming more educated, but also looking at the AOTA core documents. Our
Mhm.
code of ethics talks about justice, autonomy, fidelity, veracity. And so looking at our core values as well, we talk about those different aspects.
It's useful to go back to Ted Lasso, and he has that line about he tries to be, curious, not judgmental. And I think that there's an aspect of culture, cultural humility, competence. Really, it is that we're all on a journey and we're all learning. And so one of the best ways to learn is to listen, and to really figure out that should be our job as an occupational therapy practitioner. What is important to the person that we're treating, that we're working with. That's just such an important aspect of our profession. And so, certainly race and ethnicity and everything else that makes a person, speaks to that.
Absolutely. For our profession, our OT practice framework talks about culture or cultural about 45 times.
Mhm.
45 times. Culture impacts our context, our roles, our habits, our routines, our preferences, our values, our beliefs, the way we dress, the people we with, the work we do, our education, our access to education, our health literacy, so many different aspects of who we are as occupational beings. We should be leading the health professions in these areas of culture and diversity. When we talk about social determinants of health, that where you live, what kind of activities you're engaged with, do you have access to healthy food, transportation, uh, what is your language? All these different aspects impact our occupation, our performance, our participation. the skills that we have. But if you look at the literature with social determinants of health and occupational therapy, there is very little out there right now.
Mhm.
So we need more researchers to help establish the evidence within our profession, but there are myriad of resources available across other health professions that we can utilize to ultimately better serve our communities and our clients.
Yeah. Well, and in terms of that inclusion in our own profession, if we look at the last salary survey that was done by AOTA, um, it shows the work that we have to do. So if we look at about 91% of practitioners are female, 84% are white. There's a huge underrepresentation of African Americans, 13.6% of the general population, about 3% of OT practitioners. The Hispanic population, 19% of the population, and about 3.6% of OT practitioners. About 0.3% of us are Native American or Indigenous practitioners, and about 6% are Asian practitioners, which is actually closer to where we're at as a society in the U.S. And there's been a little bit of an uptick among students, just as you said, we're becoming a more diverse culture, especially uh, those of us that are younger than me. Um, there's much more diversity among our younger generations. But if we look at inclusion and needing to have a workforce that looks like the people that we're working with, how do we change that number? And especially in light of the U.S. Supreme Court recent decision about not really using race-based admission policies to be able to admit students. So that's a big question. So how do we get better at that, Christina?
That's a great question. So, we know that the pandemic has increased some of the disparities in education as well. And so we're hopeful that those are going to eventually settle out a little bit, but there was an upward trajectory prior to the pandemic that has been a little slow, particularly for individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and other disadvantaged groups. So the holistic admissions have been endorsed by the American Association of Medical Colleges, the AAMC, for almost 20 years now. And so they looked at some of the resources from the Institute of Medicine, the national class standards that I mentioned earlier, and even calls from the World Health Organization, for example, to look at social determinants of health, health equity, some of those different aspects through a workforce that is representative of the communities. And that is one of the standards from the national class standards as well. I highly encourage anyone who is not familiar with those standards to go take a look. And so there are strategies that we can utilize which are evidence-based to help to attract and retain students from disadvantaged backgrounds, underrepresented backgrounds. And so the Supreme Court ruling, we'll go ahead and talk about that a little bit. So it is still, we're still understanding the repercussions and im- implications. We're still understanding the repercussions and implications of the Supreme Court ruling, uh, but it looks like for now, race is not able to be considered a factor. Previously, it was able to be considered a factor when it was a part of a variety of other factors as well. And so there are other factors that we can look at related to socioeconomic status, uh, language, country of origin, geographic region, rural communities, some of these other factors, first generation college student, going to a school where SAT scores were lower than the state or national averages, for
Mhm.
example. And with OTCAS, which is the Occupational Therapy Centralized Application Service System, uh, we have access to what are called HRSA indicators through the Health Resources Service Administration, which is a federal entity. And there are about 15 to 20 questions, I want to say, that are related to uh, environmental and socioeconomic disadvantage. So those are some criteria that the applicants are able to share. There are other factors that we can look at as well. We can ask questions about what is the diversity that they would bring to the program. And
Mhm.
so that looks at other aspects and other dimensions of diversity. It allows the applicant to self-identify if they wish to. There may be some things that they wouldn't disclose because of fear of adverse repercussions, but providing those opportunities uh, is important for us. We also, when we look at the applicant pool, we historically have allowed the applicants to come to us. And so I have a saying that if they haven't heard about occupational therapy, they will not choose occupational therapy 100% of the time. And this we
Right.
know. There are not a lot of things that we do know, but that is one that that we can count on. And so getting the word out, and now we have social media at our disposal. We can conduct events. We have the online presence that we can utilize through webinars and outreach. But and not just those of us in academia, but across the profession, those of us that love this great profession have a responsibility to help spread the word about the wonders of this profession. Unfortunately, there is a lot of negativity out there that's being posted on social media right now, and my students tell me about it. I hear about it from other practitioners. Those of us who have had, which I believe are the majority, who have had those positive experiences, even though we all have ups and downs from time to time.
Sure.
And sometimes we need to make shifts in our job positions, and the pandemic certainly put some wrinkles into uh, our positions and careers. But we need to share about our love, our passion, the impact that we have with our clients and with our colleagues as well. And now more than ever before, and really, the vitality of the profession depends on it. The AOTA and our professional associations have a responsibility to be engaged in promoting the profession, but at the end of the day, each of us within our different spheres of influence can help be a part of growing and sustaining uh, this profession that we love.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so important that we have this diverse workforce and anything. All of us, we're all responsible for it, right? To try to encourage people in our spheres and outside of our spheres to consider the profession. And I think once they're in it, how do we encourage people from underrepresented groups to move into faculty positions and to move into, board of director positions? And I know, I think a sad part of our profession is so Dr. Leela Lawrence was the last Slagle lecturer who was African American, and she gave her Slagle lecture in 1969. And so the Slagle is, kind of the penultimate, kind of award that our profession recognizes, kind of scholarship. How do we encourage more diversity within, academia, within leadership of our profession? Any ideas on how we can do that?
Absolutely. So having programming that reflects that we value diversity, equity, and inclusion is really key. And that's something that can happen across all levels. It can happen in a clinical setting, in academic programs, in research, whether it's workshops, trainings, scholarship funding, sponsorships, all these different areas, we can have programs that we offer that help to say and demonstrate we value diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, accessibility, belonging, et cetera, et cetera. uh, getting the word out and communicating it is really important too. Sometimes we're not great about communicating what we're doing and letting people know. So, ensuring that we have systems and structures in place for that is really key. Getting feedback from our whether it's our key stakeholders, our partners, our constituents, and that can be through surveys, through focus groups, through listening sessions, through interviews as well. We can immerse ourselves in cultures within our local communities or other communities to learn more about ourselves as cultural beings as we learn about others, too, especially those that are in the communities where we're serving. For example, at our university, um, for the last few decades, about 25% of the infants being born in our hospital were from Hispanic Latino descent, the vast majority being Spanish speaking. And so, for our practitioners here in our local community, it benefits them to learn more about the families they are working with. I've had some students with capstone projects. One was working with interpreters in the NICU, and she created a mobile app to help facilitate the continuum of care. She provided it
Right.
in English and Spanish. And so now I have another student that's going to be helping to promote that a little bit more within the community. So, through different initiatives, letting people know what we're doing, whether it's through our website, through our social media, can help to not not just talk the talk, but to show that we are walking the walk, that this is an area that is important to us.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit about your role in COTAD and what COTAD is and how it came to being? It was kind of, you said as a student you were looking for a group that had other people that, maybe looked like you and had some of the. So anyway, I'll stop talking. You can talk about COTAD a bit.
Yeah, sure. Some of the values and interests um, at that time, and yeah, with the as an aside, the MESC Alliance for Hispanic Health, it ended up being students, faculty, and staff
Mhm.
from a wide variety of backgrounds who were just very passionate about helping to meet the healthcare needs of the Hispanic Latino community here. So, with COTAD, the Coalition of Occupational Therapy Advocates for Diversity, I would say it was similar. We were at an event. We had all come through the Emerging Leaders Program of the AOTA through different generations of it at that point. And we were at a leadership event at the conference sitting around a table. And there was the proverbial cocktail napkin where we started jotting down some ideas. With regard to the Centennial Vision in particular. And the diverse workforce of the Centennial Vision was an area that we all felt very strongly and passionately about, but we felt that we were not seeing a lot of initiatives at that time. And we were from different cultural backgrounds, different racial and ethnic, religious, geographic, socioeconomic backgrounds sitting around the table. And we thought that we could help to move our profession forward at that time through a presentation. And so we were able to get sponsorship for a session on um, diversity in the workforce, perspectives from emerging leaders. And so that later was an Ode to Practice article as well. But we discovered during that year that we loved working together.
Mhm.
It was through online mediums like this, and then with face to face at conference. And so that next year was when COTAD was born. Um, I was very grateful. Dr. Catherine Hoyt took on the role of the founding chair at that time. My daughter was being born 1 year later, excuse me, 1 month later. So
You had things to do.
I did. I was a little busy at the time, but she was just an exceptional leader and helped to grow over her 7 year tenure as the founding chair the group to a national 501(c)(3) organization, which offers a mentorship program. It offers student chapters, which have grown like wildfire
Mhm.
in over, I believe, over 100 academic programs across the country right now. There have been multiple articles, presentations, workshops, pre-conference workshops, panels, annual events. There's an annual breakfast where we just celebrated the 10-year anniversary this past April. March at conference. There are COTED Ed connects educators through the Education Summit and at the national conference and through resources, Facebook pages. The social media presence has been very strong as well. And there have been some connections to advocacy initiatives. The AOTA has been supporting the Workforce Diversity Act, for example, and we've had different individuals provide input for that. And so it's just been amazing to see
Mhm.
over these past 10 years how it has grown and evolved.
Well, I think COTAD is just such, it's something we can do to learn and to take action. And I know AOTA, Lands was a longtime AOTA employee. If you were at the conference, you probably met Lands was just, and he sadly passed away here recently. And so AOTF started a scholarship in his honor that specifically is for diverse occupational therapy students. So if you want to take an action, join COTAD and maybe go to the foundation website and make a donation to that fund, because as you said, it's our profession, and it's our responsibility to hand it on, to the next generation. You have a lot more time in the profession than I do, but to the next generation of practitioners, because as you said, culture is such an important context of all of the work that we do. So um, I just wanted to thank you for your time and for just your really life's work, as a practitioner, as a faculty member, and as a member of the board of directors, to really help us move forward as a profession, so that we do have an inclusive profession and we're meeting the diverse needs of the individuals that we're working with. So I don't know if you have any final words for us before we head out.
So I want to encourage everyone to continue to be involved, be engaged with your membership at your state level with AOTA. Your membership and engagement matters for helping to impact our profession, our societies, and our workforce. So as you have your membership, whether it's to COTAD or there are a couple other groups that are out there currently as well, it really shouldn't be an either or. And with our state and national memberships, it shouldn't be an either or. Each of these different groups has different functions that are advocating on your behalf as a student, as a practitioner, even as a constituent, because one day you may be receiving occupational therapy services as well. And so it's very important that we are all engaged and involved in helping to move the profession forward together, because that's the only way that we're going to continue to be able to grow and sustain this great profession that we love.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Christina Smith from the Medical University of South Carolina, thank you so much for your time. And I hope you and everybody else has a great day.
Thank you. You do the same. Thanks for having me.